Great. Okay. Well, welcome everyone to our online hat workshop. Lovely to have you with us, and hope you enjoy watching along and then obviously going off and stitching your own hats. So we're working tonight with a pattern. It's not actually our pattern. It's a pattern that's published, or two different patterns that are published by, I think they're from Western Australia, a company called LB Textiles. They actually have given us permission to use their patterns, and then obviously we're not sharing the pattern with you. You need to purchase your own pattern, but they're fully aware that we're doing this. And I just wanted to clarify that because it does say across the pattern in great big letters, you know, private use only, no commercial use. So I just wanted to clarify that they actually have given us permission to use their pattern for workshops, on the understanding that everyone actually buys their own pattern, which is very fair because it's their intellectual property. So we started out teaching the serpentine hat, which is this one here, or the sun hat, which, as you can see, has quite a big brim. And my daughter Lauren teaches this class, and she taught that quite a few times. And then the last time we were doing this live, I suddenly thought, oh, you know, maybe a bucket hat would be good as well. You know, not everyone wants a hat with a brim that broad. And then, you know, that's sort of a very feminine style of hat, whereas a bucket hat a man can wear as well. And a lot of teenagers like bucket hats. So I just Googled bucket hats, and blow me down, the same company had a bucket hat pattern. And interestingly, the bucket hat, the top panel and the band that goes around is exactly the same as the serpentine hat. So the only thing that's different is the brim. So I thought I'd point that out for you, just so that you know that, you know, they've used basically the same base. So if you've worked out your size in one, you'll be exactly the same size in the other. And as I said, the only difference is the shape of the brim. So obviously with the serpentine hat, it's wider and it's much more curved, whereas with the bucket hat, it's narrower and it sort of sits down as opposed to out. So this particular hat, this is quite a wide brim. So if you are going to make this, I'd suggest that you use interfacing in the brim, unless you've got really stiff material, just to give it some nice body, not quite so necessary with the bucket hat. So both of these are reversible. So the insides and the outsides are exactly the same pattern, so that you've actually got two hats in one. So this one's quite loud. And whenever I'm making samples, I always try and cover off a whole heap of different tastes so that people don't look at something and go, oh, I'd never wear that. So this one's a tad on the bright side. This one's lovely, you know, very subtle, and it's just white cotton canvas on the inside of that. And people that have come to workshops here have been across that whole cross section as well. So the beauty of being able to make a hat for yourself, or for, you know, someone in your family or your friends, is that you can just tailor it to what you would like. And if you absolutely love hats and you wear hats all the time, well, what's to stop you wearing hats to go with, you know, the garments that you make, or make hats that tie in with garments that you've bought. Yeah, and it just frees things up a little bit for you to be able to, you know, just have a bit more fun. And the good thing about these hats as well is they don't require a lot of material, which means you can dive into your stash and start using up bits and pieces of fabric that you already have, which is great. And you could even, if you wanted to as well, mix and match. There's no rule that says the top and the band and the brim all have to be made out of the same material. So you could go to town if you wanted to and sort of come up with, you know, lots of other combinations. Now, what else have I got written down here? Okay, so this is only available, this pattern's only available as PDF patterns, and there's more and more companies now doing that. It makes it really, really easy to bring a pattern to market if you're not having to have it printed, and it's cheaper for the end user, and it saves having to physically distribute patterns. This is a good PDF pattern to start with if you've never used a PDF pattern, because there's so few pages. So to give you an idea, I haven't worked with heaps of PDF patterns, but I've worked with enough to, you know the ins and outs of them all. So essentially, usually what happens is you will get the pattern will come to you as a file, and then you will get the instruction notes that go with it, and they will generally be a separate file. So say you were making a pair of trousers or a dress and you bought a PDF pattern and you printed it on A4 paper at home, you would end up with lots of pieces of paper that you then need to join together. And the easiest way to join them together, I just do it with sticky tape. The easiest way to do it, I found, is to cut off like the top edge, because there'll be a grid inside the edges of the paper. And if you cut off the top and the right of every page, then you can overlap them and just sticky tape them together. I find that makes it a little bit easier. But the beauty of this pattern is that each of the 3 pieces of the pattern are on separate pages. So that's the top and the band and the brim, 3 separate pages, which means you don't need to do any sticking of anything together. And these are the sizes are nested. So there's 4 sizes for each of those and they're all nested. And what they've given you is each pattern piece is for half. It's a bit hard to see there. Oh, that's a bit better. It's for half. So that's for the top, but it's half of the top. So what I would suggest you do, and this is what I've done, and I'll come back to printing this out, just while I'm talking about this, I actually traced it off with a piece of non-iron-on interfacing folded. So I put that down and I traced off the size I wanted, which is medium. So that means when you lift that up, you've actually got the whole top. I find it makes it a little bit easier to cut it out because you're not having to fold the fabric lots of times to cut out the various pieces. So you only need one of these for the outside. So I just pop that on one material and cut it out. So that's just a tip for you if you want to make it easier to be cutting, particularly if you're going to make more than one hat. You might like to go, actually, I'm just going to get myself pattern all organized. Or you could, if you wanted to, print out 2 sets of the pattern and then cut these out and then just sticky tape them together. And that would then give you the ability not to have to cut out on the fold. Okay. So in terms of printing out your PDF pattern, there's just a few little things you need to be careful of. And these are all little, traps that I've fallen into. So it's good to understand how it all works. When you go to buy the pattern and you've paid for it, and then you generally will get, sometimes you can download it straight from their website. Sometimes you'll get an email. But the important thing is that and if it downloads, it usually ends up in your downloads file. I then copy that and paste it into somewhere where I know where it is. So I have a section on my computer where I put all of these. So under Ministry of Handmade, then I have a folder called Patterns and Instructions. And then inside there, I've got a folder called Hats. And then I've put a folder called Sorrento Bucket Hat, and the files for the bucket hat are in there. Now, when you go to print all of that out and you click on it and it opens up on your computer, when you're printing out the pattern itself, before you press print, you need to actually look for the scale. So let me show you this particular page. Where is it? Page on it. Okay, so on the first page, I'm going to put this really close to the screen. On the first page, that's the brim, and see this little square down in the bottom corner? This will tell you that you're printing your pattern out at the right size. So you've got to read the screen and look for where it says scale. And very often it won't be at 100%. You need to change that to 100%. Otherwise, the pattern won't be the right size. So when I open anything up, it usually defaults to 96%. So you just go down and you click on scale and it will enable you to change it to 100. So then you print that out and then you physically get a ruler and you measure that little square to make sure it's the dimensions that they tell you it's got to be. I know Lauren was teaching, she's doing some private lessons with a 13-year-old at one stage, and the mum downloaded the pattern and printed it out, and they skipped over the whole scale business, and it wasn't till they'd cut it all out that they realized that the size was not correct. So you just need to be really careful of that. Please don't skip over that and go, oh, it'll be right, because the thing about a hat is it doesn't fit on your head, it doesn't fit on your head. So that's an important thing to be wary of. So you're just going to print out, so with this, as I said, there are 3 files. So the first file is the printing and assembling instructions. You don't need to assemble, just will teach you how to print that out. And then there is the file for the actual pattern itself, the 3 sheets. And then there's another file, which is the instructions on how to put it all together. So what I'm going to do tonight is basically just work through in the same order that the instructions are that are provided. And I'll do that because when you come back to do this yourself, it will feel a little more familiar if we've done exactly what's in the instructions rather than sort of jump around a little bit. So I'm going to be working exactly through here. And what I'm actually making is a bucket hat tonight. So let me just clear away. I don't need the pattern pieces. So I'm going to, or the pattern sheets, I'm going to put those away to one side. And I don't need the sheet on the assembly instructions. So I'm just going to put that to one side. Now, let me show you what I've already done. I'll shift this. So as I said, this is one I made a little while ago. We don't need that right now, so I'm going to move that. And we don't need this one either. So let's just move that. Just push that off to one side. Okay, so rightio. So once you've got your pattern pieces, so there's my, my band and my brim. So as I said, I've cut these double so that I've got the whole piece that I need. And there is the top. So when you cut these out, just be aware that you mark the notches. So the notches on the pattern are little dark lines at the top and the bottom edge. They're not a little V. Often on patterns, if you're used to sewing, there'll be a little V. They're actually a heavy line on the pattern. So you'll need to look for those. Hang on, I'll just let someone in. Yeah, so you'll need to look for those and make sure you mark those on your pattern piece. Actually, I'll show you. I do have a second camera, so I'm just going to put that onto that camera just for a moment, just to show you really closely what that looks like. Okay, so let's just twist this around. So can you see, here's one of my pattern pieces here. So I've written down band. Let me pull this back so you can see it. M means medium. I don't trust my memory for anything. So it says cut 2 of the fabric, cut 2 of the lining. Now make sure you trace off this line here. If you're not used to sewing, this line marks where the grain of the material should be when you cut out your pattern. I'll come back to that. But these are little notches I'm talking about, that these mark the middle of that particular piece. Then on the top, you can see there's a notch there, and then there's another notch here on the side, and then there's another one at the bottom and another one over here. You need those because they will help you put the hat together really, really well. And you can see here's my brim, and there's the middle notch, and then there's a notch at the bottom. There's the straight of the grain line again, and then these are my notations: brim, medium, whoops, move this down so you can see it, cut 2 of the fabric, cut 2 of the lining, cut 2 of the interfacing if you're using a lighter material. Okay, so they're all the pattern pieces there. Now let's go back and talk about the straight of the grain. And if you already know about this, I apologize, but just for the benefit of someone who maybe doesn't. So let's just pretend this is a piece of material. And this edge is the selvage, which is the edge that doesn't fray. And when you've gone and bought your material, this is where they've cut it in the shop. So the straight of the grain is any line in the material which is the same distance from the edge. So that line there, so let's just say that's 15 centimeters and that's 15 centimeters. That is the straight of the grain. It's any line that is parallel to the selvage. So when you put your pattern pieces down, the line that says straight of the grain needs to be parallel to the selvage. And that's really important because it enables the material to work in the best possible way for what you're making. Cool, so just pop that over there. Beautiful. Okay, so let's, well, we've just got this here. I don't think there's any, oh, I'll just show you. So I've just cut out, so here's the top for my hat. And you can see there's a notch up there. There's another notch here on the side. So I've marked those markers. And here are my 2, this is the band. So you can see there's my notch at the top. There's my notch at the bottom. And then here is my my brim pieces. So I'm just going to flip back to the other camera now, just to make it a bit easier to get the scale. Yeah, okay, so you can see there's my two brim pieces, there's my two band pieces, and then that is my the piece that's the top of the hat. And then what I've done earlier today, just to save a little bit of time, because the lining, well, I mean, it's reversible, so we'll call it the lining, the bit that we're going to put on the inside to start with, but you can flip the hat out the whole way. I've already done a little bit of sewing because you're basically making two things and joining them together. I've just thought I would do this ahead of time just to save you sitting waiting while I sew things. So that is, I've already stitched that together and I've already top stitched it. And this material, which is just, I wanted something plain to go on the inside of this green fabric. And this is a lovely fabric, but it's just a little bit light. So I've interfaced all of that just to give it a little bit of body. So hang on there, I'm just going to mute Michelle. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so that's that piece done. And the other thing I did, here it is down here, was I already did this little bit as well, just to save some time. So this is that part, the crown part that goes on your head. And what I'm going to do now with the other material, it's exactly the same process. It's just that it will just help keep things move along a little bit. So we don't need those just for the moment. So I'm just going to pop those to one side. Okay, so let me get the notes and let's, so all the cutting instructions are included on the second page where it says cutting layout. That's all there for you. So you can just follow those notes. It explains to you how to lay it all out. And then it also says to please pre-wash your material, because if you're working with natural fibers which tend to shrink, you want it to shrink before you make your hat, so that if it does shrink, it still fits on your head. Cool. Okay, so we don't need that page. We don't need that page. If you are going to interface the brim of your hat, I suggest you use iron-on interfacing. It's just easier to work with. What I've done is I've actually interfaced all of my pieces, because this material was quite light. With the bucket hat, because the brim's quite small and pokes down, you really don't need it to be as stiff as potentially that hat there. Rightio, so let me just put that over there. Okay, so let's have a little look. So step number one, it says, I'm just going to work my way through this. It says, place the two band pieces together, right sides facing. So the band is this bit that goes around your head like that. So what I'm going to do is just going to put the two pieces together like this, and I'm going to pin them so they don't move. I'm a big fan of pinning. I don't often go, oh, it'll be right, I'll just sew that, because I have a motto, I'd rather pin than unpick. So, and this is fairly, the sizing of this is fairly critical, because we're joining two different circular shapes together. You want to make sure that everything's right. And this pattern has a 1 centimeter seam allowance. So I'm just going to pop this into the sewing machine. Let me find my foot pedal, and I'm going to stitch my 1 centimeter seam allowance. I'm going to back stitch at both ends. So I'm just going to do that bit. Okay, take that out and cut that off. And then I'm going to do the other side as well. Rightio. So basically I've created my band now. So it looks like that. So I like to have this, like put the side seams to the sides when the hat is finished. So it says you do that. And then it says to, I'll just cut off these threads, snip those off. And we're going to press the seams open, because what we're wanting to do is minimize a buildup of bulk. So I'm just going to press those open. And because this is a natural fiber, I'm working with a cotton canvas. Cotton has a really good one. I just made it. I call it crease memory. So you can press it with your finger and it'll pretty much stay lying flat. So I'm just going to do both of those. That's what it says. And then it says repeat this step with the band pieces in the lining fabric. Well, I've already done that. So what I'm going to do as well, where I've got those two little seams, I was actually going to top stitch that with, because I'm using a dark green thread, and I'm just going to top stitch on either side of that stitching line. So a top stitch is purely decorative. It doesn't really serve any purpose. It will help keep the seam allowance lying open, but it just adds another, like a design detail. So I'm just going to top stitch both of those. Now I'll flick to the other camera and show you what I've done. So give you an idea of what I've done. Stitch that. Straight down there. Rather than cut the threads, I'm just going to scoot across to the other seam all in one go. Top stitching is optional. Don't think just because I've done it you have to. It's up to you whether or not you want to do that. It's not actually in the notes, but I'm a bit of a fan of top stitching. Trim off those threads. Snip that one there. Beautiful. Yeah, so without swapping to the other camera, let me just, I don't know how clearly you can, well, you probably can't see that very well. I'll just flick to the other camera so you can see exactly what I've done. There we go. So you can see I've just stitched down either side of my seam with a little row of stitching, and there's the other side as well. And that's pretty much the same color as the lining fabric I'm using. So that's why I'm just introducing some of that color into the other side. Rightio. Okay, so then it says in the main fabric, place the two brim pieces together right sides facing, sew along the side seams using a 1 centimeter seam allowance, press the seam outwards. So basically that's, we're just going to read, we're just doing exactly what I've done to the main part of the material, or to the band. I'll cut that off there. Now this pattern, oh, what I didn't cover at the beginning, sorry, about the sizing. There's an illustration there about where to measure your head. So it's simply just a matter of putting a tape measure around your head where the hat would sit. And that's how you judge what size to make the hat. So I'm making a medium. My daughter made a hat for her 6-year-old by using the smallest size, the extra small, and using 1.5 centimeters for the seam allowance instead of 1 centimeter. So that'll give you an idea that you can make the hat smaller. You could also make it bigger, I guess, if you wanted to. Just have a look at the pattern. I'm sure you could work that out, how to make it just a little bit bigger. Right, so I'm just going to do the stitching here. Across. Both ends, and then I'll stitch the other end of that one. So take that out, cut that off, get rid of our stray ends, and do exactly the same thing again, which is basically fold the seam allowances open, because in the notes they recommend using a fabric with a little bit of body, and if you keep the seam allowances together and fold them both the same direction, it's just going to get very bulky. So I'm going to fold that open like that, press it with my fingers. You could press it with your iron if you wanted to, but this is lying really flat without that. Just going to top stitch those edges as well. Same way. Down the other side. Break those. Beautiful. Okay, so now you can see we've got, that's one part of our brim. So that's the outside of the brim, and we've got the outside of the crown. And then there's my one I prepared earlier. And then there's my other brim, which I've already stitched onto the top. Okay, so let's move down to the step 3. It says, place the brim in the main fabric against the brim in the lining, right sides together and the seams all matched up. Sew along around the bottom edge of the brim using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. So I'm going to get this piece of brim and this piece of brim, and I am going to, no, that's the band. This is the brim. I was wondering why that looked like the wrong size. So good sides together, and we're going to put the 2 seams that exactly on top of each other. So I like to pick to the inside, make sure I've got all of that lined up. So those seams are exactly over the top of each other. And then I'm going to go over to the other edge. I'm going to make sure these are perfect, match up those seams perfectly. And again, pin that in place like that. And then I'm going to go to the halfway mark, find my notches and make sure that they all line up as well. Set. Pin that. Go to the other side. Line that all up as well. Sitting really, really nice. Just be aware that if you use interfacing in your brim, what the interfacing will tend to do is it will remove much of the stretch from the material. So if your outside piece doesn't have any interfacing and the inside piece does, you just need to make sure it all lines up beautifully before you start sewing. So I'm just going to pin around that bottom edge because that's where I'm going to sew. A few pins. And as I said, I'd rather pin than unpick. Find that demoralizing. So it's faster to pin in the beginning than to unpick. So pins. So I probably got about, I don't know, 12 pins around the bottom of that edge. And just get that all lined up. So now I'm going to stitch the whole way, and I'm actually stitching the bottom edge. So what will be, you know, when you're wearing your hat, I'm stitching this edge down here, the bottom edge. Right, so I'm just going to pop that into the sewing machine and 1 centimeter seam allowance, and I'm just going to stitch the whole way around there. Out of the way. Beautiful. Take the pins out as you go. Nearly there. Quite a bit more. Okay. So now I'm going to take that out of the sewing machine. Just remove those pins for the moment. Going to pop them straight in the pin cushion as I went. Anyway, get rid of those. Okay, so if we read the notes, it says sew around the bottom edge using a 1 centimeter seam allowance, which I've done. So then it says trim notches into the seam allowance to allow the brim to sit better once it's turned out. So basically, if you've got your notes, you can have a little look down there. If not, I'll flick to the other camera and I'll show you exactly what we're going to do. And this is really important to get the best finish you possibly can. So let me just turn the other camera on for you. Okay, so if we have a look here, this is the drawing we're looking at. So you can see how that's got little notches cut into it the whole way around. So what that means, what they want you to do is, if we look at the bottom of the fabric, what they want you to do is go around and basically cut little, where is it there? Cut little V's out of this the whole way around. And the reason they want you to do that is when this is turned through, effectively this piece of material is going to end up sitting like this inside the brim. And this piece of material is bigger because it's circular. The length around the outside is longer than the length of your stitching. So if you don't put those little notches in, it's going to be a bit bubbly. But by putting those notches, it allows the material to lie against itself like that. See the difference that makes? So that then this curve will be really nice instead of all bubbly. So I find the easiest way to cut those is to do this. I fold the material like that, and then I cut my little V's like that. And I find that's faster than doing 2 cuts for every notch. So I'll show you again. I just do fold it like that and 1 slice, and you've got a little V. So you're just going to do that the whole way around the bottom edge so that it ends up looking like you're drawing. Just be careful that you don't go too close to your stitching line. Just going to do that the whole way around. This is fairly standard practice whenever you're joining anything circular together because you need to get rid of bulk. So I'll just scoot
So
down.
how close together are you making those notches? 1 centimeter, 2, 1.5?
Well, if you have a look at the camera, where are we? That they're probably about 2.5, 3 centimeters apart.
Okay, thanks.
It's like that. Just work my way around like that. I just do it by eye. I don't measure them. Okay. Once I'm done, I'll keep it on camera. I'll lie it out flat and just do that little demo again. I mean, in the drawing, there's heaps of them. I haven't got as many as they put in the drawing. Nearly there. This will make a difference though. So, you know, there's little things that make lots of difference. So don't skip over this or go, oh, I'm not going to do that many. I only do a few. You just compromise the finish at the end if you don't do all the steps. Nearly there, just a couple more. One more. All right. Okay, so let's lie this down and you can see what I've done. So that's basically the whole way around. So now when I turn this through and this little edge gets folded upwards, these little pieces can now nest next to each other as opposed to making a great big bubble. So let me turn this through. I'll click back to the other camera. Okay. So what I'm going to do is just basically turn this so that this edge that we've stitched becomes the outside. So now you can see I've got my green side and I've got my white and green side. And I fold that out like that. And then this, when you lie those pieces of material together, that becomes your brim. So it's a matter now of going the whole way around there. Actually, let's turn to the next page. And it says, hang on, 2 pages at once. It says, turn the brim out so the right sides of the fabric are facing out. press the hem of the brim flat. Now that's really important. So I'm just going to, oops, just it was me disappearing while I turned on the iron. It's really important that you get that stitching line right out onto the edge. So don't have your fabric a bit puckered. Just, yeah, take the time to get that so that it sits really, really nicely, because that will contribute to a really lovely finished product. So if every time I do, not just online classes, classes in person, I always say to people, if your ironing board, because sometimes people look at me and go, ironing board, what is this thing called ironing board? If you don't have an ironing board, and I've met lots of people who don't, there's some people say, I don't do ironing. If you're going to be sewing, and particularly if you're working with natural fibers, you're going to need an ironing board. So you don't have to buy a great big one. People say, oh, I haven't got space. Just go to Big W or IKEA or something. You can get little tabletop ones for about $10, and go to Kmart and get yourself a $15 iron and keep them where you sew. So if you have a big ironing board and a nice iron, and it's in a place that's removed from where you're sewing, so maybe you're sewing at your dining room table and your laundry's the other end of the house or it's downstairs, can I humbly suggest that you move your iron and your ironing board to the space where you're sewing, because it is so tempting not to iron if you have to physically get up and walk to the other end of the house, turn on the iron, wait for it to get hot. You go, oh, who cares? It'll be right. Lots of pressing equals lots of lovely sewing. So that's one of my hot tips for the, sorry about the pun, hot tips for the night. Let me just press this. It will make such a difference if you do this part of it. So I'm just working to get that seam right on the outside. Really does make a big difference. So sometimes you can sort of roll the fabric between your fingers just to get that stitching line right out to the outside. Your finger in there and just push it back. Won't take long. Work it, get it right. Nearly done. Okay, that's it, whole way around. Beautiful. Okay. So press that, made a lovely crisp edge the whole way around. And then it says, press the brim flat, top stitch close around the edge of the hem. So that basically you're going to do a row of stitching fairly close to that, that stitching line you've just made. It's up to you how close you put that to the edge of the brim. You could use perhaps the width of the presser foot if that's what you would like to do. If you'd like to stitch really quite close to the edge of the fabric, that's your choice as well. And then it also says there, optional, top stitch more parallel rows from the original line of stitching to secure the lining to the main fabric, which is what I'm going to do because I think it adds some nice interest. So before you do that, pin the inside edge together so the fabric doesn't tend to sort of skew or go a bit weird on you while you're sewing. So I'm just going to put some pins in that so that I know that when I stitch, nothing moves. I remember the last hat I made, it wasn't a hat that had a band and a crown. It was multiple pieces that sort of got or went away to nothing. But I remember the brim, I started and I just basically went round and round and round and round and round all the way to the edge. That was heaps of fun as well. So you could try that too if you wanted to. And you could do, you could do contrast stitching. It just depends on the fabric that you've chosen for your hat. Right. Okay, that's enough pins. Rightio. So bear with me just while I do some stitching. I'm just going to stitch. Where are my threads? So I'm going to start on one of the seams, and I'm going to do this as neatly as I can because this is going to show. So I'm just going to work my way around. And just keep your eye so that it's nice and neat. Back to the end, and then I'm just going to do a really lovely little neat back stitch there. Just a couple of stitches. Beautiful. Okay. Then I'm going to pull that out and cut that off. So I won't do those extra rows of stitching now because that'll just take time. I can come back and do those later. And you could as well, when you're making a hat, you might, decide towards the end that you want to add more stitching. That's no problem at all. So basically that part of the process is now finished. So I'm just going to put that to one side. Rightio. So the next bit, we're up to number 4. It says based stitch 0.8 of a centimetre from the top edge of the band to use as a guide. So let me demystify that for you if you've read it. Some of this language I found a little bit cumbersome. So basically what you're going to do, I'm going to flip to the other camera and explain exactly what we're going to do so that it makes hopefully a little bit more sense. So the word based is another word for like stay stitch or to tack. So basically what we're wanting to do is this is let me move that so you can see it all. So this is the brim. This is the top edge across here. There's, just to give you the lay of the land, there's one of my side seams. There's one of my notches. This is the edge that we're going to join the top onto. And what they want you to do, the based stitch 0.8 of a centimetre from the top edge means they want you to stitch a row of stitching all the way around the top, like where I'm dragging the pin. That is 0.8 of a centimetre from the edge. Now the reason, let me give you the logic for that. When you actually stitch the top on, you're going to stitch with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. So the 0.8 sits just inside that. So the reason they want you to stitch around here at 0.8 is the next step is going to be to slice the material with the scissors to enable this top edge to stretch enough to join onto something that is circular. So the basting stitch that you're going to do is really just a guide so that you don't cut too far. So I'll stitch that and then we'll come back and look at that again. Okay, so base stitch, if you wanted to, you could just do that in a bigger stitch because it'll be faster to sew. So on this machine, 0.8 is just the width of the presser foot. So I'm just going to stitch the whole way around the width of the presser foot.
So we're doing the top edge of the band.
Yes, this is the top edge of the band.
Sorry, Julie. So we're making you make the crown and the band part as a whole piece,
Yes.
and then, okay, different to the brim.
Yeah. Michelle, if you wouldn't mind just going on mute, because what happens with Zoom is when you talk, the camera goes on to you, which is just your black screen. Yeah. So if you've got some questions, I know it seems a bit weird, but if you could pop the questions, there's a little chat box. Because this is being recorded, it's easier for everyone when they watch it back to have it just the continuous work that's happening. Does that make sense? It's probably on mute. Right. Okay. Yes. So let me give you a bit more logic for that, just to explain what Michelle was saying. So this is the band, and this bottom edge where my hand with my watch is, that is going to join onto the brim, and the top part is going to join onto the top or the crown of the hat. So let me just go back to the other camera and I'll show you exactly what we've done so that it makes sense, because this is the bit, because the bits we've done so far, stitching the brim and the band pieces together, are fairly straightforward. But what we're going to start doing now is we're joining pieces together that are different shapes, and that's the bit that can be a little bit tricky. So let me just show you what we've done. So you can see what I've done there. I've stitched, so that is 0.8 of a centimetre the whole way around the top. So let me just scoot back on that so you can see what I've done there. So there's my stitching line. This is the top, and then this is the bottom that's going to join onto the brim. And what they want you to do now is to get your scissors, and we're going to snip down to that line the whole way around like that. So the top of the band has to stretch to join onto the, let's just call it the crown. It's a little bit easier. So by doing that snipping, see how this now will start to stretch, so that when you go to join it onto a circular shape, it's going to fit much more easily. So you snip that the whole way around. So when you want something to be able to go bigger, you put little nicks in it. And when you want it to be able to go smaller, like we did just before, you put notches so it can lie flat against itself. So let me just finish scooting so you can see what I'm doing. And that's why they got you to do that stitching line, because otherwise how easy would it be to cut too far? Whereas this is like, it's like drawing a line, I guess, and you've just stitched a line to work to, which makes life a little bit easier. So I'm going to do that the whole way around. And again, this is all part of being able to create a really lovely finish. I think I'm almost back to the beginning. Nearly there. Okay, so I've gone the whole way around, and you can see now, let me flip it back this way, like that. When we get rid of those little things, when we go to join it onto the circle and we need to stretch it, see how the fabric it's got more give in it because we put those little nicks into it. So that's what that means when it says snip into the seam allowance of the band to allow a better fit. Rightio. So now I'll go back to the other camera just for a second, and then I'll come back to this one again. Rightio. Okay, so it says place the right sides of the band against the right sides of the top or the crown. So basically the easiest way I found to do that is to just flip that inside out like that. So if you've got a set of notes there and you have a little look under number 4, the drawing on the left-hand side, the hatched or the darker parts is the inside of the material, and the white parts is the outside of the material. So you can see what they're showing you is this is the outside, and then you've got the outside of the crown facing upwards, and you're going to match your notches on the crown to the notches on the band. So I'm just going to find those and line those up to start with, and I'm going to pin this on the side where I've just done the stitching. So I'm going to pin it on the band, not on the crown. So I'm going to do that notch there. Whoops. So there's 4 notches to line up. So put that one there, like that. Then the next one, line that up, that, and then number 4. So 2 of those are the side seams on the band. So they're all 4 equidistant notches on each piece. So what I've done there is, I'll flick to the other camera because this is one of the bits that is probably the trickiest if you've never done anything like this before. So I just want you to be able to see exactly what I've done. So if I put that down there and I lift this back, whoops, you can see there's the band and there's the top, and I've pinned it only in 4 spots. And now I'm going to go back and finish off that pinning. So I'm going to end up pinning the whole way around on the outside. So I shall just do a little section of that to show you, and I'll put it back in front of the camera again before I go back to the main camera. So what you can do as you go around is you'll need to start to see how those open up when you stretch that onto the top part, and you just pin your way around. And I like to pin vertically like that. I find it a little bit easier. I'm left-handed, but if you're right-handed, do it with your other hand. And I like to pin like this. I just find it easier to sew this way and then to pull the pins out as I go. Right, so you can see now, see how that fabric's sort of just opening up a little bit as you stretch it onto the part at the top. This would be almost impossible to do if you didn't put these nicks in it. So you can see I've got a spot here, and then there's my next spot there. So this is a quarter of it that I'm now going to join together. So start at one end, and then I just work my way across, pop the pins in, make sure the edges are all lined up perfectly, because you want the top when it's finished to be nice and round. And just pop the pins in as you go like this. Beautiful. So here's my next quarter. So there's the seam, there's the notch halfway. You can see there's, whoops, there's a quarter of the top that I'm going to pin together like that. I'll pin into there, and I'll just work my way around, making sure as I go that it's all going to fit, and sort of stretch it and do a test fit, and I go, yep, that's looking pretty good. Let's pin like that. And then that's, I've got this, I've done 3 quarters, and here's the last quarter that needs to be done. So I'm just going to lie those together and just stretch that and pin it. So this is what I did this afternoon with the lining. I've already done that part, and you can see why I did it, because otherwise it's very tedious. Watch me do this twice. Rightio, and there's the last one there. So you have a little look, you can see, actually, if I put that down there like that and lift the camera up, you can sort of see what I've created. So there's the other view, well pinned the whole way around. And now what I'm going to do is stitch those together, but you use the 1 centimetre seam allowance so that the that basting stitch is inside your seam allowance. So let me just take this off here just to free up a tiny little bit of space, just to make it a little bit easier. Pop this into the sewing machine. Doesn't really matter where you start, because you're just going to stitch it the whole way around in a circle. And when I do things like this, I don't usually back stitch, because when I come back to the end, I just overstitch where I started. So I'm going to pop that in there, and I'm just going to start sewing and take the pins out as I go. I never stitch over pins. You run the risk of breaking the needle or bending the pin or burring the needle. Just work your way around there. Actually, I need to shorten that stitch length. Have it bigger before. Okay. Just work your way around carefully, making sure that the edges are all lined up. the beginning again. Right, so I'm going to lift that up, pull that out. So that's been stitched the whole way around. So now it's joined together and I've taken out the pins. And if we turn that through, you can see that it looks like the top of the hat. So I always double check. You just want to go the whole way around, make sure that it's sitting really nicely. Just check that you haven't accidentally stitched any little puckers or anything into it. If there's any part of it not right, then just, you know, out with the quick unpick and just unpick that little bit and restitch it. Okay, so it says there, yes, join them together, repeat this step for the lining, and I've already done the lining, right. Right, yeah, it was, and then now I'm reading out the section. If you've got the notes there, this is the bit I found slightly ambiguous. I knew what they were trying to say, so I want to explain this to you. It says trim into the seam allowance so the top piece is notched to match the band. Press the seam towards the band. So basically what they're saying is the top piece of material that's the top or the crown, that seam allowance now when it's lying down on the side of the band is going to be fluty. So remember when we took notches out of the edge of this so that when we folded it back it sat flat, they basically want you to do the same thing on here. So if you turn that through so that you can see the seam allowance, what we did before was we nicked the fabric so that it would open up so it would sit flat on the circle. Now the circle is being folded down and you run the risk of it being bubbly. So they want you just to go around and take notches out of that seam. So I'll just demonstrate that for you. So if you have a look at this, so you can see, hang on, let's just turn that around. There's the my stitching line the whole way around. So this is the edge that we nicked. So you can see the little nicks. You can see my original row of stitching that was the marker for the nicks, then my row of stitching that joined the pieces together. What they want you to do is just, if we look at this side, it'll probably be a bit easier. I'm looking at it now from the crown. And what they want you to do is go around and basically just do that again to reduce some bulk, because this is going to lie down flat and we don't want it to be bubbly. So I'm just going to work my way around. If you look at the last drawing, you can see what they've done. That's in the middle of the page, the second row of drawings, the one on the right hand side, you can see that they've notched that fabric. So I'm just working my way around doing what we did before. So we just want to take the bulk out of this fabric so that when we fold it flat on the band, it sits nicely. And I'll go the whole way around and then I'll demonstrate that what I mean. What happens when you work with circles and flat pieces? You need to make allowance for where they meet. Half, cut a little piece out. Be very careful that you don't cut up to your stitching line. I'm nearly there. Okay, so let me lie this out flat and you can see what we've got now. So give you the view there. So we've got the notches the whole way around, and the reason we need to do that is when we fold the crown down onto the band, we need to make space for them to, these pieces to be able to nestle in next to each other like that. Okay, so it says turn it through, where are we? Turn the fabric the right way out. So you turn it back out the right way, and what they want you to do is top stitch. Hang on, let's get rid of that little thread there. I want you to top stitch on the edge, where are we? On the edge of the band the whole way around. So what we're doing is taking the seam allowance, the seam you've just created. Hang on, let's just pull this back a little bit so that you can see. So there's the band with the crown on the top. The seam allowance gets pressed down towards the bottom of the band, and then they want you to top stitch around there to hold that flat. So what I'm going to do first up, swap back to the other camera and show you what I'm going to do. So again, I'm going to go the whole way around there with my fingers. Remember we talked about finger creasing, so I'm going to pull that seam out so that it's the stitching lines right exposed beautifully like that. And as I go, what I'm doing is I'm using my fingers on the underside to make the seam allowance lie down flat in line with the band. So I'm just making that all sit flat. You could sort of take this to the ironing board as well as if you wanted to, but it's just a bit hard to do because it's a 3D shape. It's not flat. And so I'm going to pop this into the sewing machine now, and I'm going to stitch all the way around the top of the band, just underneath the seam. And that will help hold that seam in place. And once I've done that, I'll show you, I'll put it back on the camera and show you. So I'm going to start at the side seam. I'm going to press the seam allowance towards the band. So the seam allowance is away from the crown, and you're going to make sure that everything's sitting beautifully flat. And I'm just going to pop the foot down, work out where I'm going to stitch. Make sure that the seam allowance is facing down towards the bottom of the band. And I'm just going to start sewing. Take your time when you're doing this because you just want to make sure that the seam allowance is all facing the right way. What I'm doing is I'm sewing this, I'm actually in my left hand, I'm touching the crown with my left hand and I'm touching the band with my right hand, and I'm physically pulling them away from each other to make sure the seam is really, really flat. And then I've also got my fingers underneath, making sure the seam allowance is facing towards the band so that it's be lovely and flat when I'm finished. And the seam allowance isn't caught up. Now, obviously I've got a dark thread on quite a light coloured fabric here. If this freaks you out, or if you're not super confident about your straight stitching, just pick a thread that coordinates really well with your material and you'll hardly even see it. Going over the side seam in the band, so that's a little bit thicker than the rest of it, so just take your time. If you've never made a hat before, this is like a lovely creative challenge. I had a lady come to, actually it was the first time we did this workshop, almost this time last year, I think it was December, and she came with her mother and they both made a hat each. That was lovely, the broad brimmed hat. And she went home and within, I think, 10 days, she had made 10 more hats. I think she was on holidays from work or something. And she just used fabric that she already had at home. I said, what were you going to do with 10 hats? She said, I made them for my friends. We had a get together and I said to them all, have a hat. She said it was lots of fun. So, and she'd never stitched a hat before. So I guess that means it's slightly addictive. Okay, so that was just my little back stitch to make sure that my top stitch was all nice and tidied off. So now I'm just going to grab the scissors, snip out the threads, and I'll flick back to the other camera so that you can see exactly what I've done. Here we go. So where are we? Here's the camera. So on the inside, so you're looking, this should help you get the lay of the land. This is the band, there's the side seam, this is the crown at the top, and here's the seam allowance facing down. And the top row of stitching that you can see is the seam, and the row of stitching underneath that is the top stitching. So when I flip it through to the other side, it looks like, where are we? There's the camera there. So you can see that's my row of top stitching. So you can see the positioning of that. It's just below that seam line. And I've just gone the whole way around, stitching beneath that line. Rightio. Okay, so hang on, let's get it in here. That's probably easier for you to see. Yeah, so this is the crown here. So that's basically what we've done. Okie dokie. Right, so now it says, we're down at the bottom of that page. It says press the bottom edge. This is talking about the band. Should say press the bottom edge of the band up by 1 centimetre only on the main fabric. So that's this guy here. Let me flip back to the other camera. Right here, and I can see something in the chat box as well. Let me have a little look at that. Could you use pinking shears? Yes, you could. Or I don't. You could use pinking shears, but I don't think they would take out, all the pinking shears I've seen really don't take out enough bulk of fabric to make a difference. I'm assuming you mean instead of doing those notches. Pinking shears only take out little tiny bits. You really need to get some of the bulk out of the material. Yeah, so basically it means this part here, they want you to press up the bottom edge by 1 centimetre only on the body of the hat. So I'm just going to fold that up and pin it. Here we are, some pins. Pin that around, flick the iron back on. Hang on. Oh, it is on still. Okay. Pin that up. Use a tape measure if you don't. I'm pretty good at judging a centimetre. Okay, let's work that way around doing that. Put in the ironing board. Nearly there. Wait for the iron to get hot and I will I'll press that. You want that to be, I know what's coming next, so you want that to be nice and even and the right measurement. It's fairly critical. Okay, so now I'm just going to, so you can see we're dealing with a shape that's sort of like a little bucket, so it's a bit hard to lie it flat. So you sort of keep it on its side like that's probably the easiest thing to do. Just work your way around, press that down. Okay, so I've been the whole way around and I've just pressed, so you can see there's the little edges folded up in there. All good. That's lovely. That's cool. Rightio. Now I'm on the next page. It says number 5. So we don't need putting this to one side for a moment because it says place the right side of the lining top band. It's this against the lining side of the brim. So let me sit down. Would you mind getting me another pin cushion, please? I've used up all my pins. Rightio. So we've got this is the brim that we stitched earlier. Okay, so we're going to put the right side of the lining. Let me read that again. Place the right side of the lining against the lining side of, yes. So basically what we're going to do is put this, thank you. We're going to put the green, my green, which is my lining, against the green side of this. So the lining side, the right side of the lining top band against the lining side of the brim. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to match up my side seams. So I'm going to go, I look at them really closely, I lie them against each other, and I make sure that they're lined up really, really nicely. And then I'm going to pin those together like that. There's raw edges matching, seams and notches lined up, pin in place and sew together. So what I'm going to do, we've got 4 markers that they gave you. They've got there's the notches in the halfway mark, and there are the seams. So set those up first, find those. So I'm going to pin my 2 lots of seams together, checking that they're over the top of each other really, really well, like that. Then I'm going to go to the point that's got the notches, which is the halfway mark, and I'm going to line all of those up like that. Pin that. So I do those 4 points first. So then I'm going to go to the last notch, which is there. Line all of that up. All the raw edges are all lined up as well. And I'm going to pin that. So I basically connected it in 4 spots. So you can see it's sort of starting to look like a hat. Right. So now I'm going to go back and I'm going to pin all those intermediate spots the whole way around. So where are we? Let's start pinning here. I've actually pinned it on the brim side, so I will do that as well. You just work your way around. Heaps of pins, because it's so much easier to pin than unpick. Don't skimp on the pins, basically. Okay, here's my next section here. Lined up. And the whole way around. Good. Fit. To get it all pinned really well, you need to be able to be sure that when you stitch it, you're not going to stitch any little pleats or puckers into it. So you might need to give it a little bit of a stretch or a little bit of a pull. I always like to double check that everything's sitting right. I've got one little spot here that looks like it could be a problem, so I'm just going to realign that. Because I've got interfacing on the inside of my lining, it's a little bit more rigid, like I mentioned earlier. So pin that well the whole way around. And when I'm happy that I can stitch that without it sort of puckering or anything, I am going to stitch that with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. So a couple more pins and I think I'm good to go. Yep, I'm happy. So yeah, just double check that you've got all the edges lined up, and so that's it before I start stitching. So yes, starting to look very like a hat. Okay, so I'll pop this into the machine, and doesn't really matter where you start because you're stitching in a circle. Line that up with the 1 centimeter mark and start sewing. There, okay. Work your way around. So I'll put that in there. So if I was making the other, like the bigger brimmed hat, the whole process is exactly the same, just that we'd be dealing with a brim that was thicker and a lot more fabric in it. Well, not thicker, wider. Apart from that, the process is exactly the same. If you've got on your sewing machine the ability to have like a free arm like this, if you've got a piece that comes off to create a bit more accessibility, certainly do that. It makes it a little bit easier. Down we go. Nearly there. Last little bit. Back to the beginning. Right, pull that out, cut that off. Right. Okie dokie. So now the brim is stitched on. So that's with all the pins are taken out, and there's your hat looking like that. So that's obviously, that's well, my lining or the inside, but if you've got, you know, if your hat's completely reversible, you might, it's got two outsides basically. So that's the process to stitch that on. If we turn it through the other way, it still looks like that. So you can see the inside of the band and the top. Now, if you've already got your notes there, I would like to add a little bit of extra information there. And if you don't have your notes yet, or you haven't printed them out, make a note if you want to add this in. When we, remember when we stitched the crown onto the band and we did that row of the basting stitch and we nicked it, I would do that on the bottom as well, because it, to me, that's fiddly to get that to fit on without snipping the material. They want you to snip it now, but it would have been easy to actually cut that before you attached it. So you might like to make a notation there that says next to the number 5, actually before number 5, where we go back to number 4. So if at the end of, after we've done the top stitching around the top of the crown, and then it says fold up the bottom of the outside fabric by 1 centimetre, that's the end of 4. Before you get to 5, so just put a note above 5 that's maybe called 4A, would be to do a basting stitch around the bottom of the band and nick that the whole way around exactly the same way that you did the top, and you'll find that that brim will go on a whole lot easier. Okie dokie, so that's all done. Rightio, so now having done that, and it says, now they want you to, this says clip into the seam allowance and press the seam upwards. So as I said, I think it would have been easier to actually do that clipping of the band before you started. So let me just nick around there. So this is the seam I've just created by stitching the brim onto the band. It's going to go the whole way around and nick that with the scissors. Back to the beginning. Okay, so basically this, this seam here that we've just created where my finger's running, that's what I've just nicked. So I'll flick to the other camera so you can see it nice and close. Oops, where are we? Yep, so you can see I've just nicked this. Hang on, let's lie that flat. I've nicked that. See what I've done there? And then that gets folded up towards the top of the hat. Okay, back to the other camera. This one. Rightio. Okay, so last step says number 6, put the main fabric, the top and the band, this is this piece, in the main fabric over the rest of the hat. So basically I'll just take out all those pins that I used there to press the fabric. Okay, they will come out. Rightio. So this is this piece here, and it's got the little seam pressed in. This goes down over the top like that, and you're going to line up the seams. So I'm going to first up put the line up all of those side seams together and pin through that. And I'll just in a second flip to the other camera so that you can see exactly what I've done. So I've done one side, then I'm going to go all the way around to the other side, find the other side seam, line that all up so that it sits exactly on top of itself, like that. So if you read it, it says, ensure the seams are in line. Yeah, pin in place so that the folded edge of the main fabric is covering the uppermost line of stitching around the brim. So let me go back to the other camera. I'll show exactly what they mean when they say that. Okay, so you can see, if I lie this flat, I need that to be a bit taller. There we go. So you can see I've got my stitching lines all lined up on both sides. And if we come in nice and close and see what I've done there, and you want to make sure that this folded edge covers up, just covers up that stitching line the whole way around. So you're very carefully going to work your whole way around, pinning that in place. So I'll go back to the other camera. Cool. Yep, so you do both sides, you do the seams first, and then you go back and you pin this in place the whole way around. And I like to use my fingers as I go to make sure that that's aligned exactly, because what you're going to do now, once that's all pinned, is stitch on the outside through all of those layers. So you're going to secure the outside part of the hat onto the bit we're pinning on now. You're going to secure that in place by stitching through all the layers. So you just work your way around, pinning that so that it's ready to stitch. Like that. Around. Almost there. The whole way around, and then show you what that looks like. So you can see that's in position now, and then it's a matter of going back. You pop that into the sewing machine and you just stitch the whole way around through all of those layers. So make sure that when you pin that on, take your time to do it so that the seam, the folded edge of the outside part is hitting in exactly the right place, so that when you stitch through all of the layers, the row of stitching on the inside is located in exactly the same position. I'm pretty sure that all makes sense. So let me just scoot this in here. And get that started. Oh, just change that stitch length. Whoops. Very carefully, just work your way around, stitching that big piece. Take the pins out as you go. Way. To the beginning, tiny back stitch just to secure that. Right. Pull that out. Whoops, lift that up. Pull it out. Snip that off. Okie dokie. Rightio. Awesome. Okay. A couple of pins there that I can pull out. Beautiful. So that's pretty much your hat finished. Now, you might like to make a note, because this last row of stitching is probably not the easiest thing to do. And the idea is that it ends up in, as I said, exactly the same place on the inside. If the thought of doing that is freaking you out a little bit, because I know because we've workshopped this here, and I remember, you know, how people respond to different stages of the process. So if you're thinking that you're maybe not comfortable to do that, or you don't trust yourself to stitch well enough to be able to catch it on the inside in exactly the same spot, you might like to make a note, and that is in step number 5, instead of stitching the brim onto the lining, stitch the brim onto the outer, and then when it's time to attach the lining, so basically we would have just done this in the reverse order. This is the lining. What you could do if you wanted to, having already top stitched the outside without the lining, you could actually hand sew the top part of the lining on. If you feel more comfortable doing that, that would give you a better result. So it's entirely up to you. So how you approach that. So yeah, if you can make a note there if you want to, under 5, that you could actually stitch the brim onto the outside of this and then attach the lining by slip stitching. So that's basically your hat finished. So I'm happy for everyone to unmute, and if you've got any questions about anything, now is your chance. Fire them at me.
No, it was very easy.
It is easy. Good for you. That's the attitude.
And understandable.
Understandable, yes. Yeah. It's really, I mean, it's quite straightforward. If you've never done it, if you've never stitched circles onto straight pieces before, this is really great skill builder. I know we used to do a piece of furniture called an ottoman. So it was round, like a round footstool. That was basically a round piece in sides. And we did that month after month after month after month. We've done so many of them. So I've watched heaps of people do it. So this pattern covers off the simple steps really well in terms of putting those notches into it and putting the slits. It's all about just helping those two pieces fit together really well. Yeah. So wardrobe of hats. Look, I'll even put it on for you. Oh dear. Yeah. So good. Well, I'm glad, Deb, that sort of makes sense to you. That's
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not good at reading patterns, so to see it is easier for me to understand it now.
The process, yeah. And the thing is too, as I said, Morris will send you the link, and then you can just go back and watch that. You know, if you're uncertain about any part of it, you can just sit and watch the video again. or the bits that you need to, because some of it's really quite straightforward, like joining those two pieces together is easy, joining these two pieces together is easy. It's really just the circle onto the straight pieces is just, it's a great skill builder.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, cool. So any other questions? Or is everyone happy, ready to dash off, make hats for everyone for Christmas?
Yeah.
And one lady came to the last workshop, and she had this sort of Australiana fabric. It had Aussie flags all over it. And I said, who's this for? She said, this is for my husband. I said, I'm going to a hat workshop. And he said, well, make one for me. I want a hat to mow the grass in. It was very Australiana. Oh, dear. Yeah, cool. So no other questions?
No.
Happy as can be?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thanks for your company tonight, and look forward to seeing you at another online class.
Thank you
Thank
so much.
Most welcome. Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.